In all three analogies, Kant is interested in what it takes for us to represent things as an objective time order. Right? It is the case that we experience the world as objects spread out in time. Some of them coming before others, some of them maybe happening simultaneously, some events happening simultaneously, and all of them belonging to the same one single time. That is an objective order, right? We're talking about objects here. We are not talking about a merely subjective play of sensations, which would never rise to the level of experience, as Kant uses the term experience. So we know from the deduction that this is what happens, right? That we do in fact experience the world as this objective time order. Now in the analogies, Kant is going to ask us how we do that, what is involved in that. And it turns out, of course, that it's the three categories of relation that are involved in that. And the first category that Kant looks at is substance. And substance, according to Kant, is something that we need in order to make comprehensible how we represent all things as belonging to the same one single time. Right? Every event that happens in the same time. Okay, not at the same time, but in the same time. There's not more than one time, like totally separate from each other. That doesn't even make any sense, according to Kant, to try and think that. Okay, so we do in fact think of things as objectively belonging to this one same time. How do we do that? What do we represent when we do that? Well, Kant tells us again and again in the analogies that time itself cannot be perceived. So, representing things as belonging to the same time, as all happening in this one time that they happen in, cannot involve like representing time itself and then maybe recognizing in each of these appearances that, oh look, it's the same time, right? As if we would recognize that somebody is wearing the same suit on different days. Like, oh, there's this event and there's that event and that event. If I check them out really carefully, I can see that they happen in the same time. That doesn't make any sense. So what is involved in representing all these events in the world as happening in the same time? Well, Kant thinks that there's only one way to do that. What it means, what we are doing, is we are representing all of them as changes in a persisting substance. Right? As changes in a persisting substance. What underlies the unity of time, what underlies the fact that all events happen in the same time, is that all events are modifications of one eternally persisting substance. So according to Kant, in this first analogy, that is the only way to make sense of the unity of time, and therefore, well, because the unity of time is given, it's a priori certain that we have to represent all phenomena as happening within this one single time. Therefore, it is a priori certain that the category of substance applies to the world, that there is this persisting substance, or as Kant tells us here, when the first analogy is sort of presented, the principles presented, he says in the first edition, all appearances contain that which persists, substance, as the object itself, and that which can change as its mere determination, that is, a way in which the object exists. Or, as he tells us in the second edition, in all change of appearances, substance persists, and its quantum is neither increased nor diminished in nature. I'll say a little bit more about that quantum there, because that didn't really appear in the story I told you just now. Okay, let's read through Kant's proof, the B edition proof, which he appended to all of the stories about the categories here. All appearances are in time, in which, as a substratum, as persistent form of inner intuition, both simultaneity as well as succession can alone be represented. Simultaneity and succession are going to be the two relations of events in time, and Kant will talk about them in the second and third analogy. The time, therefore, in which all change of appearances is to be thought lasts and does not change, since it is that in which succession or simultaneity can be represented only as determinations of it. Right? So time itself doesn't change. I mean, it also, in a sense, doesn't really change, stay the same. It is sort of the underlying unity in which succession and simultaneity is to be represented. Now, time cannot be perceived by itself. Again, Kant is going to say this again and again. Consequently, it is in the objects of perception, that is, the appearances, that the substratum must be encountered, that represents time in general, and in which all change or simultaneity can be perceived in apprehension through the relation of the appearances to it. However, the substratum of everything real, that is, everything that belongs to the existence of things, is substance, of which everything that belongs to existence can be thought only as a determination. Consequently, that which persists, in relation to which alone all temporal relations of appearances can be determined, is substance in the appearance, that is, the real in the appearance, which as the substratum of all change always remains the same. Since this therefore cannot change in existence, its quantum in nature can also be neither increased nor diminished. Now again, I mean, what Kant is telling us here is he's telling us that there's got to be something, that there's got to be a way in which we represent the unity of time, right? If I represent to myself some events that are happening and some other events that are happening and some further events that are happening and yet some other events that are happening, and nothing else, right? Let's just suppose that the category of substance does not apply to what is going on. Well, in what sense am I representing these things as happening within the same time? Right? In what sense am I doing that? I think we might be tempted to say, and I'm not even saying that this is wrong, that maybe if we can represent them as happening in succession, then maybe that could underlie a sort of unity in time. But Kant definitely seems to be thinking that we can only represent succession if we first, and this also I guess makes some sense, we can only represent succession against the backdrop of this unitary time, right? I mean, we require the thought of unitary time in order to even think of a relation of succession or a relation of simultaneity. So for Kant, before we can even think about succession or simultaneity, we've got to be able to think the unity of time. Well, no mere list of events is going to sort of give us the representation of that unity of time. We only get the representation of the unity of time by considering all these events as modifications of one underlying substance. And it's got to be eternal in a sense, because if it's not, right? If it lasts for an hour and then we have a new substance, then time breaks in two, right? But time doesn't break in two. Time is a priori a unity. So a priori we are positing this underlying substance, which persists through time. Okay, so that makes some sense, and maybe we can also have some questions about that, but I think it does make some sense. Kant perhaps muddies the waters a bit later on when he gives us the example of a philosopher who wonders how much smoke weighs. And I think he muddies the waters a bit in the sense that whereas his conception of substance is like it's transcendental, it's not an empirical concept of substance. It doesn't like immediately have any sort of specific empirical consequences. Reading this example might make us believe that it does. So let's check out what he says. So here we are at A185. A philosopher was asked, "How much does smoke weigh?" He replied, "If you take away from the weight of the wood that was burned the weight of the ashes that are left over, you will have the weight of the smoke." He thus assumed as incontrovertible that even in fire the matter, substance, never disappears, but rather only suffers an alteration in its form. And so this makes it appear as if the second analogy attempts to establish the principle of the conservation of mass, right? And that can't be true, right? The whole idea of mass, the whole idea of weighing, is an empirical idea, right? We're not talking about that here in the Critique of Pure Reason. So what Kant presumably means is that believing in an underlying substance that has to persist is a precondition for something like the principle of conservation of mass to make any sense at all, right? We need to have an underlying substance in order to even come up with conservation laws. He doesn't mean that the principle of the persistence of substance is or implies the conservation of weight or the conservation of any other empirical quality. He can't possibly mean that. Okay. Now, a little later on, here's something that Kant writes that I think is enlightening about his project here in the first analogy. So here we are at 8.186, and he talks about whether or not we should be worried that, you know, things when things come into existence, right? Is it maybe we ought to have the possibility of things coming into existence because that's sort of, I don't know, implied by the creation story or something like that. This worry, Kant says, is unnecessary, for here the issue is only appearances in the field of experience, the unity of which would never be possible if we were to allow new things, as far as their substance is concerned, to arise. For then everything would disappear that alone can represent the unity of time, namely the identity of the substratum in which alone all change has its thoroughgoing unity. Right? So Kant tells us that we can't allow substances to come into existence, right, at any point in time, because when we do so, we are sort of cutting up time. Right? It seems that if a substance comes into existence that wasn't there before, well, that substance would seem to be the foundation of another line of time. And now we have these two sets of substances, these two lines of time, and the relation between them is incomprehensible, literally incomprehensible, because we cannot even, like the form of our intuition is this one single unitary time, not like different timelines that could come together or split apart. It can't be an a posteriori question whether, like, the things in the universe, sort of the underlying substratum continues in its existence, or whether, you know, new stuff appears all the time, because if it did, the idea of the unity of time would disappear. So substance that persists through all of time, it is by representing every event as a modification of a single underlying persisting substance that we represent all these events as happening in the same single time. Right? That is the basic idea. It is by representing events as modification of an eternal substance that we represent them as happening in one single time. And it's the only way in which we can do that, according to Kant. And that is why the category of substance is necessary. Okay, what about this quantum that I wanted to talk about? Well, there's been a lot of criticism of Kant's talk about a quantum here, right? It really makes it seem as if he does want to defend something like a conservation law, because a quantum seems to be something that we have to be able to measure. So what is it that we measure, right? Extension, weight, mass, all of that might seem to bring us perilously close to an empirical law instead of a transcendental principle. So some authors, for instance, Henry Allison, in his monumental work on the Critique of Pure Reason, has defended Kant, and basically Allison tells us that The only thing that substance can be is matter, and the only thing that matter can be is like pure, the pure transcendental thought of matter is extension in space, and therefore, you know, if the substance has to remain the same, then the extension in space has to remain the same, and that's a quantum, and so Kant is right. And maybe Allison is right, although I must say that I myself have some worries about even the applicability of the quantitative categories to substance, right? I mean, the axioms of intuition and the anticipations of perception have shown to us that, you know, the quantitative categories apply to appearances, but substance is not an appearance, right? It is something in the appearances. It is something that we represent in the appearances, but why would this aspect of the representation be amenable to quantitative treatment? I don't know. I mean, I worry there, and I worry that Kant is sliding into an empirical, into saying something empirical here. That's something that clearly, therefore, commentators may disagree on. All right, so much for the first analogy. We go on to the most famous of the analogies, and in fact one of the most famous passages in the entire Critique of Pure Reason, the second analogy, which contains Kant's thought about causation.